Hollywood. A private reception. Late 1960. No premiere, no cameras. Just a room where reputations are decided without witnesses. Men stand in tight circles, drinks in hand. Laughter breaks out. Sharp. Deliberate. He's just a truck driver who learned how to wiggle. More laughter. Then a pause. Elvis Presley is in the room. He doesn't turn around, doesn't smile, doesn't react at all. Silence stretches, uncomfortable, unfinished. Beside him stands Marilyn Monroe. She hears the joke clearly, and for the first time that night, her expression changes. This isn't about defending a star. It isn't about anger. It's about recognizing a familiar execution, the kind done quietly, politely, by people who never risk their own names. No one expects her to speak. And no one expects what she's about to say, because in the next few seconds, a single sentence will expose who truly belongs in that room, and who has been mistaking power for importance all along. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The room had been designed to look casual, which in Hollywood usually meant expensive furniture pretending not to care. A low ceiling, warm lamps instead of chandeliers, glasses that were never quite empty. It was the kind of private reception where nothing official happened and everything important did. Elvis Presley stood near the edge of it, close enough to hear, far enough not to be included. He wore a dark jacket, conservative by his standards, hair carefully restrained, a man recently returned from the army, consciously sanding down the edges that once made parents nervous. He had learned discipline overseas. He had learned silence even earlier. Around him were men who spoke with confidence, sharpened by decades of power, producers with studio contracts folded invisibly into their pockets, screenwriters who measured people the way they measured box office numbers. Their voices carried easily, practiced for rooms like this. They talked about pictures in development, about budgets, about casting, and inevitably about him, not directly. Never directly. Someone laughed first. It was the kind of laugh that asked for permission and received it instantly. Then a voice followed, smooth, amused. "Funny thing about Presley," the man said, swirling his drink. "America loves him. But I still see the truck driver. Hard to build a serious film around that." The words landed lightly, wrapped as a joke. But everyone in the room understood the test beneath it. This was not humor. This was calibration. A way to see whether the subject would flinch, smile, protest, or expose himself. Elvis did none of those things. He kept his posture loose, his face unreadable. He had been mocked louder than this, cruder than this, by people with less to lose. He knew that reacting would be the only real mistake. Silence, in rooms like these, could be either weakness or refusal. He chose the latter. What few noticed was that the man who made the joke was no guest drifting through the evening. He had influence, casting influence, the kind that decided who would be taken seriously and who would be tolerated. Elvis recognized him instantly, and with that recognition came clarity. This was not about a laugh. This was about reminding him where he supposedly belonged. Across the room, Marilyn Monroe had stopped smiling. She had been half listening, as she often was at gatherings like this, accustomed to hearing herself discussed as an object even when she stood 3 feet away. But something in the tone cut through her distraction. She heard not just the joke, but the assumption under it. The casual certainty that some people entered rooms by accident and others owned them by birthright. She glanced at Elvis. He wasn't embarrassed. That was what unsettled her. He looked contained, as if he were observing the room rather than standing in it. She recognized that look. She had worn it herself years ago when she learned that pleading never earned respect. It only delayed dismissal. The laughter faded quickly, replaced by new topics, but the air did not recover. Politeness resumed its role like a badly repaired mask. Marilyn kept watching Elvis, no longer as an icon, not as competition, but as a man being measured by standards designed to exclude him. And for the first time that evening, she understood exactly what kind of room this was, and what it tried to do to people who didn't play along. Marilyn didn't move toward Elvis right away. In a room like this, sympathy was another form of theater, and she refused to give them even that. She stayed where she was, letting the conversations flow around her like perfume, sweet on the surface, choking if you breathed too deeply. She knew the mechanics by heart. Praise delivered loudly, so it could be repeated. Doubt delivered softly, so it could never be pinned to anyone. People here didn't break you with shouting. They did it with smiles, with "just kidding," with decisions made after you'd already left. Across the room, Elvis remained still, as if he'd stepped slightly behind himself. The men who'd laughed a moment earlier were already talking about something else: budgets, locations, the names of actresses said with the casual ownership of men who believed they invented beauty. Yet Marilyn watched Elvis the way you watch a door after hearing the lock click. He wasn't defending himself. He wasn't performing charm. He was listening, absorbing, cataloging. That detail mattered more than the insult. She remembered a real afternoon from years earlier, an office that smelled of cigar smoke and paper, a producer leaning back like a judge. He hadn't raised his voice. He'd simply looked at her as if she were a product with a flawed label and said, almost kindly, that she wasn't an actress, only packaging. Everyone in the room had smiled politely, as though a truth had been spoken. The same truth was being spoken now, just with different words. Marilyn's stomach tightened, not from anger, but from recognition. This wasn't about Elvis's past. It was about permission, about reminding him that applause from the public didn't grant membership in the private world that decided careers. She could have crossed the room and offered him comfort. That would have been harmless. That would have changed nothing. Instead, she aimed at the system. When the next wave of laughter rose, smaller, more cautious, she stepped into the conversation as if she'd been part of it all along. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It came out controlled, almost conversational, like a remark made for the benefit of the room rather than any one person. "It's interesting," she said, letting the silence notice her before the men did. "How people who never filled a stadium are so confident deciding who matters." The sentence wasn't a speech. It was a blade placed on the table. Someone gave a strained chuckle, then stopped when no one joined. A producer's smile froze halfway. A writer looked down at his glass as if it might provide instructions. The air turned thin, and suddenly everyone remembered that Marilyn Monroe was not a decoration. She was a headline they couldn't control once it left her mouth. Elvis didn't rush to thank her. He didn't even turn fully toward her. He stayed quiet, and that made her words heavier, as if the room had to sit with them without relief. A man tried to rescue the moment with a new topic, something about an upcoming script, a harmless name drop. But the conversation wouldn't stitch back together. Not cleanly. Not tonight. Marilyn held her expression steady, her eyes calm, as if she'd merely commented on the weather. Yet she could feel the shift. The laughter had lost its ease. The test they'd set for Elvis had suddenly started testing them instead. For a few seconds after Marilyn spoke, nobody seemed to remember what their hands were supposed to do. Glasses hovered midair. Cigarettes burned unnoticed. The room had the stiff pause of a stage when an actor forgets the next line, and everyone prays the curtain will fall. And then the attention drifted, inevitably, toward Elvis. They expected him to turn it into a joke, to soften the embarrassment for them, or to bristle, prove their point, storm out, and give the story teeth. Hollywood loved reactions because reactions could be edited into narratives. Elvis didn't give them one. He stepped away from the wall and walked straight toward the man who had started it. Not fast, not slow, measured, close enough that the surrounding voices lowered without anyone admitting they'd been listening. When Elvis spoke, it wasn't for the room. It was for one person, delivered at a volume that forced people to lean in if they wanted to steal it. "You're right about one thing," he said, his tone calm, almost courteous. "I did drive trucks." The man's mouth tightened, readying a comeback. Elvis didn't allow space for it. "That's how I learned to listen," he continued, eyes steady, "to people who don't get invited into rooms like this." It landed differently than an insult. It wasn't a defense. It was a quiet rearranging of the furniture. Suddenly, the man with the drink looked smaller, and the truck driver sounded like the only adult in the house. A few faces shifted, not outrage, something more unsettling. Recognition that Elvis wasn't here begging to be accepted. He was here observing who needed acceptance to feel powerful. The man forced a laugh, thin as paper. "Now that's a line," he said, trying to make it harmless again. Elvis nodded once, as if agreeing with a minor detail. Then he let a pause stretch, long enough to be uncomfortable, short enough to remain polite. "And I don't need anyone to fight my battles," he added, still addressing the man, but letting the room hear the edges of it. "I just remember who laughs." That was the moment the temperature changed, because it wasn't a threat in the usual Hollywood sense. He wasn't promising revenge, wasn't declaring war. He was stating a simple fact. He had a memory, and he had time. In an industry built on favors and future phone calls, that kind of restraint could be more frightening than shouting. Marilyn watched him from a few steps away. There was no triumph on her face, no smile meant to claim credit. Only a quiet respect, sharpened by something close to sorrow. She'd spent years watching men perform power loudly. Elvis had done something rarer. He'd taken control of the space without raising his voice, without needing permission. Around them, people pretended to resume conversation, but their words were scattered, unfocused. The old confidence didn't return. It had been punctured. Elvis had refused the role they offered, the grateful outsider, the entertaining novelty. Marilyn's gaze stayed on him as he stepped back, not retreating, simply choosing distance. In that moment, she understood what the room hadn't. He wasn't dangerous because he could cause a scene. He was dangerous because he could deny them one and still win. The reception continued, at least on paper. Music returned at a lower volume. Servants refilled glasses with careful timing, and people reorganized themselves into smaller circles as if proximity could dilute what had just happened. The evening had survived, but something essential had been dented. Elvis was no longer near the center of the room. That wasn't exile. It was choice. He stood closer to the hallway now, half turned away, listening more than speaking. A few guests glanced toward him and then away again, the way people look at something they've misjudged and don't want to admit it. Near the bar, two men leaned toward each other, voices dropped below courtesy level. One of them, a studio functionary with a reputation for surviving every regime, didn't bother masking his irritation. "He's not stupid," he said, eyes tracking Elvis. "That's the problem." The other man nodded slowly. Intelligence, in their world, was forgivable only when it was obedient. Elvis's wasn't. It didn't ask for approval. It didn't soften itself to be liked. Elsewhere, laughter attempted a comeback. It succeeded in volume, not in confidence. The jokes were safer now, blander, aimed at topics that couldn't stare back. The room had learned, if only for the night, that some people remembered too much. Marilyn found Elvis near a narrow window that looked out onto a dark garden. For a few minutes, no one else seemed interested in joining them. Not because of respect, because of uncertainty. Nobody knew what role to play around them anymore. She didn't thank him. Gratitude would have cheapened the exchange. Instead, she spoke quietly, eyes forward, as if the glass reflected more than the garden. "They don't forgive people who don't beg," she said. It wasn't sympathy. It was information. Elvis nodded once, not surprised. He understood warnings when he heard them. He had grown up in a world where consequences arrived without announcements. This was simply another version of that lesson, dressed in tailored suits. "I know," he replied. Nothing defensive, nothing proud, just acceptance of the terrain. They stood in silence for a moment longer. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask to be filled. Marilyn sensed something then, not resignation, but resolve. Elvis wasn't recalculating how to please these people. He was deciding how little he needed them. When he left, it wasn't dramatic. No goodbyes, no final glance meant to linger. He slipped out earlier than most, a quiet departure that went unnoticed for several minutes and then couldn't be ignored. Heads turned too late. Conversations faltered again. Someone asked where he'd gone. No one answered. What lingered wasn't the joke or even the confrontation. It was the awareness that a line had been crossed and someone had walked away without paying the expected price. And for the first time that evening, the room understood it might not be the one keeping score. The months that followed did not bring confrontation. They brought paperwork. By 1961, the headlines still called Elvis a king, but his days were increasingly spent on sound stages that smelled of paint and compromise. Scripts arrived neatly bound, cheerful, harmless, musical comedies, easy laughs, roles that required charm, not depth. He read them carefully anyway, late at night, seated alone, aware of what each page implied. He understood the message without needing it. Explained, "This is where you belong if you want to stay agreeable." The decisions about him were being made in offices he never entered, often by men who had been in that room. They never mentioned the evening outright. They didn't have to. The punishment was subtle, opportunity redirected, ambition managed downward. One afternoon, his manager returned from a meeting, looking irritated in a way that tried to pass for calm. He didn't sit immediately. That was always a sign. "They say you're difficult," he said finally. Elvis looked up. "Because?" A pause. Then the truth, delivered without decoration. "Because you don't play grateful." That was the charge. Not arrogance, not refusal, self-respect. In Hollywood, gratitude was currency. You were expected to thank the system for whatever portion of yourself it allowed you to keep. Elvis had stopped doing that. Quietly, consistently, he didn't argue. He didn't storm into studios demanding better material. That would have been easier to manage. Instead, he began doing something far more unsettling. He declined, selectively, privately. Projects that felt empty, roles that treated him like a brand rather than a man. He passed on them without explanation. Word traveled fast, stripped of context. Ungrateful, uncooperative. Thinks he's smarter than the room. Each refusal tightened the circle. Offers didn't stop, but they narrowed. The films he did accept paid well and cost him something harder to name. He watched himself on screen and recognized the smile, but not the person behind it. The loneliness crept in quietly. Fame insulated him from silence in public, but not in decision-making. There were moments, late, after shooting wrapped, when he wondered if Marilyn had been right, if refusing to beg carried a price higher than anyone admitted. Still, he didn't reverse course. What he felt wasn't rebellion. It was preservation. He had survived too much to let himself become a permission-seeking version of his own success. Somewhere else in Los Angeles, Marilyn Monroe was facing her own reckoning, discovering how quickly admiration turned conditional when it wasn't reinforced with obedience. Different roles, same machinery. Their paths didn't cross again. They didn't need to. The system that tested them had long memory. And so did Elvis. By the early 60s, Marilyn had learned how quickly control could slip away without making a sound. Meetings were missed on her behalf. Decisions arrived already finalized. The tone around her shifted from indulgent to impatient, as if seriousness were something she had borrowed and failed to return on time. She felt it in the way conversations ended when she entered rooms, in the careful concern that masked irritation. Hollywood no longer argued with her. It simply worked around her. What stayed with her unexpectedly was that night. Not the tension itself, but the way Elvis had carried it. He hadn't tried to convert doubt into applause. He hadn't asked the room to love him. He had stood inside himself and let the consequences gather where they might. That memory sharpened something in her. During a private lunch with a journalist she trusted, not an interview, no recorder on the table, she spoke without ornament. The conversation drifted, as these things often did, toward men, careers, survival. Someone mentioned Elvis in passing, half curious, half dismissive. Marilyn didn't smile. He was the only one in that room, she said, slowly, who didn't ask to be loved? The journalist raised an eyebrow, sensing weight where there should have been a quip. Marilyn didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The sentence stood on its own, uncomfortable and exact. It was never printed, not directly. But Hollywood had its own way of circulating truths that weren't meant to be quoted. The line resurfaced in fragments, altered but intact in meaning. People began to describe Elvis differently, not as a rebel, not as a puppet, but as someone who didn't depend on approval to exist. That unsettled the industry more than scandal ever could. Elvis heard about the comment months later, secondhand, stripped of context and softened by retelling. Someone mentioned it casually, as if passing along gossip. He didn't respond right away. He understood what it cost to speak plainly in that world. Marilyn had paid in silence, in diminishing patience from those who once claimed to protect her. He never called her, never sent a note. Gratitude, he knew, would have made it smaller than it was. What lingered instead was a shared understanding, unspoken but precise. They were navigating the same machine from different angles, learning that honesty didn't shatter systems, it simply revealed who they were built to serve. By then, something else had begun to form beneath the surface, a sense that time was narrowing, that one of them might soon lose the ability to answer back at all. The feeling wasn't dramatic. It was heavier than that, and it stayed. The news reached him without ceremony. Not through a radio announcement, not through a headline pushed across a table. It came in a quiet voice from someone he trusted, said almost carefully, as if volume itself might make it unreal. "She's gone." Elvis didn't ask who. There was no need. August of 1962 had already been carrying a strange weight, the kind that settles before anything is confirmed. He nodded once, slow, as though acknowledging a fact he had been expecting but never prepared for. He didn't cancel anything. He didn't make calls. He didn't release a statement shaped by lawyers and concern. The world would hear plenty soon enough. None of it would be for him. Later, alone, the evening replayed itself without permission. Not the headlines, not the photographs everyone else would memorize. The room, the low ceiling, the glasses, the joke that pretended to be harmless. The way Marilyn's voice had cut through it, not sharp, not loud, just exact. The way she had spoken as if she already knew what the price would be. He sat still, hands resting where they fell, and let the memory finish what it had started years earlier. She had said what he never would have. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood how permanent words could be once spoken aloud. Hollywood, he realized then, punished people on two different schedules. Some were worn down slowly for showing weakness. Others were erased quickly for refusing to disguise clarity as charm. Marilyn had been the second kind. The realization didn't come with anger. It came with a tightening, a quiet understanding that there was no safe way to be fully honest in a place built on controlled illusions. She had crossed that line more than once. Each time the room had pretended not to notice, until it did. He thought of her face that night by the window, not sad, not defeated, alert, as if she were watching something approach from a distance. Elvis remained silent publicly because silence was the only thing left that still belonged to him. Mourning, in that industry, was expected to be visible. He refused to turn her into a gesture. Instead, something shifted inward. He didn't speak her name in interviews. He didn't reference her when people talked about loss. But decisions began to change, small ones at first. then larger, choices that moved him further from rooms where laughter was used like a weapon. He carried her memory the way he carried everything else that mattered, without display. And in doing so, he understood something essential. Some people survive systems by adapting. Others, like Marilyn, reveal them by refusing to disappear quietly. He chose a third path. He would remember. By the middle of the decade, the machinery that once carried him effortlessly had begun to feel heavy. Films still came, contracts still arrived neatly typed, but Elvis felt the distance growing between the man he was becoming and the version the industry continued to sell. The rooms had changed, yet they sounded the same. Approval was still conditional. Silence was still misunderstood as weakness. He stopped chasing it. The decision wasn't announced. There was no dramatic rupture, no manifesto. It began quietly, with a refusal to rush, a refusal to decorate himself for people who listened only when it was convenient. He spent more time alone with music that didn't need explanation, gospel, blues, songs that carried scars instead of polish. By 1967, those around him grew uneasy. The formula that had always worked was being questioned from the inside. He asked for fewer cameras, fewer handlers. He talked about wanting to feel exposed again, as if exposure were not a risk, but a necessity. When plans for a television special took shape, the expectation was clear: spectacle, nostalgia, shine. Something safe. Elvis pushed back. He rejected the glossy sets. He stripped away the distance between himself and the audience. He chose to sit, to sweat, to be seen breathing between lines. The decision startled people who had built careers protecting stars from reality. "This is risky," someone warned him. He didn't argue. In a private moment, away from rehearsals, he said something that wasn't meant to travel beyond the room. "I don't want to be untouchable," he said quietly. "I want to be real, even if it costs me." The words weren't defiant. They were settled. What emerged in 1968 wasn't a comeback in the traditional sense. It was a return to presence. The voice carried weight again because it wasn't asking permission. The performance didn't challenge the system directly. It simply made it irrelevant for an hour. Those who watched understood instinctively that something had shifted. He wasn't performing for approval anymore. He was offering connection and letting the consequences fall where they might. Somewhere beneath it all, the memory of Marilyn lingered, not as tragedy, not as warning, but as orientation. She had understood the danger of honesty early. He had arrived there later, by a longer road. The difference was timing. As the applause faded and the lights dimmed, Elvis felt no triumph, only clarity. He had stopped trying to survive rooms that required him to disappear in pieces. The final answer, he realized, was never confrontation. It was truth, carried long enough to become unmistakable. The night had already loosened its grip on the building. After the concert, the corridors emptied slowly, the way they always did when adrenaline gave way to fatigue. No reporters lingered. No cameras waited for a final remark. The kind of silence that followed wasn't staged. It was earned. Elvis sat alone for a while, still dressed, collar open, listening to the distant sounds of dismantling. Metal cases closing, footsteps fading. Applause existed now only as a memory inside his chest, already settling into something quieter. Someone from his inner circle passed by, hesitated, then stopped. Not a manager, not a handler, someone who knew when not to press. They spoke casually at first, small things, travel, schedules. And then, without intention, a name surfaced, spoken lightly, almost absent-mindedly. Marilyn. It hung there, unguarded. Elvis didn't respond immediately. He wasn't avoiding the name. He was letting it arrive fully. Years had passed since he'd allowed himself to think of her without restraint, but the image came back intact. The controlled voice, the steady eyes, the refusal to soften truth so others could remain comfortable. "She understood something," he said finally, his voice low, unshaped for performance. Before most of us did. The other person waited. Elvis continued, not looking up. This place doesn't destroy weak people, he said. It destroys honest ones. There was no bitterness in it, no accusation, just a fact observed and carried for a long time before being spoken. The room stayed still. After a moment, he added one last sentence, quieter than the rest, almost to himself. That's why I never laughed that night. Nothing followed, no explanation, no elaboration. He didn't need to clarify which night. Anyone who mattered already knew, and anyone who didn't never would. The conversation drifted away after that, naturally, as if it had reached its only necessary point. Elvis stood, nodded once, and left without ceremony. What remained wasn't a lesson or a moral. There would be no summary, no instruction offered to the listener, just the understanding that the joke had never been about him, and the defense had never been about him either. It had been a test. And in that room, years ago, the people who believed they were measuring worth never noticed they were the ones being measured instead.